Live. Good evening or good morning from wherever you are joining us. My name is Mohanad Hajali. I'm the Deputy Director for Research at the Malcolm H. Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Welcome to the third panel in our 2024 Global Outlook Conference, in which we will discuss the emerging threat in this multipolar global order. I'm delighted to welcome two distinguished speakers from the Carnegie Endowment's Nuclear Policy Program: Mark Hibbs, a non-resident senior fellow who has written extensively on non-proliferation; Nicole Graevsky, a fellow at the program who is also working on a book on the Russia-Iran relations from Ukraine to Syria. And also at a later stage, hopefully, we will be Rose Gottmiller, a non-resident senior fellow, also a veteran US diplomat and a former deputy secretary general for the NATO, will join us at a later stage during the discussion. These past 2 years have seen significant transformations globally, from the war on Ukraine to the Gaza conflict in recent months, in which the nuclear threat has taken on new dimensions. As a new world order continues to unfold, the threat of nuclear proliferation and the potential for regional conflicts involving nuclear armed states have escalated. The Russian President Vladimir Putin had hinted that he might resort to his nation's nuclear arsenal in the course of the conflict, and recently an Israeli minister said that nuking Gaza is on the table, twice, while advances in Iran's nuclear program has prompted other MENA countries to pursue a similar course to counterbalance Tehran. Without further ado, I will start the panel discussion with Mark Hibbs and the question of multipolarity in the global order. Mark, should we view this proliferation drive and these threats as symptoms of insecurities in an unfolding multipolar global order? And how do you think we should assess them?
Well, Mohanad, first, thank you for inviting me to this meeting. Certainly, without any question, insecurity is at the heart of this dilemma. I would not argue, however, that multipolarity per se is predestined to lead to nuclear proliferation. What may be happening here is that the multipolar world affords space to non-nuclear weapon states, especially if they are not allied with a big power, to consider and engage in proliferating activities, or to flirt with latency in a way that they wouldn't tend to do were they enmeshed in an alliance system with a power with considerable military capabilities on their behalf. If you look at the history of proliferation over the entire trajectory of it since the beginning of the Cold War, the end of World War II, you could perhaps conclude that during the Cold War, there were more countries that were engaged in proliferating activity than there are today. If we go back and we look at the record, we say particularly states that were not part of the bipolar system. The bipolar system being a system that was basically set up and established, arose through rising power of the United States and the Soviet Union, that this system, if you want to call it that, it wasn't watertight. There were lots and lots of holes in it, obviously, worldwide. And so what you saw during the Cold War was a situation where proliferators outside of that bipolar system or bipolar arrangement um, were proliferating or were involved in proliferating related activities. Um, there were states of Latin America, there was Pakistan, there was India, South Africa, Libya, even to a lesser extent, Romania, a country which was not formally part of the Soviet bloc and was certainly not part of the Western group. Um, these states were outside the system, and they, for reasons that may have had to do with their own security assessment or the deeper insecurities, um, proliferated or engaged in proliferation-related activities. Um, so, if you look at even in Europe, Western Europe, which was thoroughly linked and enmeshed in relations with the United States and important weapons, nuclear weapons states in the European Union. Even in Western Europe, there were holes in the system. You had two countries, Switzerland and Sweden, which were on the basis of their own sovereign concerns and their resolve not to be part of an alliance system. Both of those countries flirted with nuclear weapons in the early days after World War II. And so this would indicate, or this would suggest to us, that multipolarity is clearly front and center here in the discussion of decisions countries would make about having nuclear weapons or not. But it may not be multipolarity per se. It's more, the question is whether the country sees an opportunity to engage the system to get benefits in a way that that would be easier for the country if it wasn't part of an alliance. So that's what we've seen, and today we still have countries that are in alliances. We have countries that are not, and in a number of cases we have states that are looking around and they see that in developing relations with other states that are adversaries of the United States in the West, they may be able to uh, get something out of the system that otherwise they wouldn't do if they were straitjacketed in one alliance system. Even if a country is a member alliance, a country may try to expand the frontiers of its independence. We see that in Turkey. It doesn't mean Turkey is a proliferator. To all accounts, it isn't. But the key word in your introductory remarks, Mohammed, was insecurity, and that brings into mind other factors that could be at play here. Iran, the biggest problem that we're dealing with in the region, worldwide indeed, concerning nonproliferation. Iran is an aggressive regional power with lots of enemies, and the country is not a part of an alliance system. It's very much on its own, and to that extent, it's insecure. There are also domestic drivers involved in this. In the case of Iran, again, this is a country which is a closed, theocratic military regime. There is severe repression in Iran. There is domestic unhappiness and opposition to the regime. And lastly, and not least, the country has a failing economy. So, the Iranian regime would be, in my view, insecure, and to that extent, it may want to engage in proliferating activities to deal with its insecurity, to overcome it in some way. Iran is not alone in the region in this regard. There's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi government may likewise feel that today it has more space to push against limits of what it may or may not be able to do in its international security relations, including the determination of the extent of its nuclear development. The Saudis may feel that they're no longer tied to the United States they would have been before. In the nuclear development area alone, not nuclear weapons, but nuclear energy, compared to, say, 10 or 15 years ago, Saudi Arabia today has many opportunities. They have options. South Korea, the United States, European Union, China, and Russia. All of them are potential nuclear energy development partners. So looking forward, I mean, if the Saudis choose a partner or partners to move forward, and if they want to engage in activities which are proliferating, then it would depend on the response of the supplier state more than anything else, because it's directly, deeply involved in the nuclear development program, to respond. And in a world that we see moving toward, there are questions about whether some of these countries who are stepping forward as nuclear suppliers are firmly committed to the norms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty as we understand them.
Mark, just quickly to comment on what you're saying now, that first, that you see a continuity with the past in terms of nuclear proliferation, and the fact that now we have more insecurity. That's the main trigger. But the question of compliance and international institutions, specifically the IAEA, do you think that the multipolarity, kind of this new order that's emerging across the world, kind of complicates compliance and makes the process more difficult within these institutions? Is that, do you see that as an issue?
Well, yes. The most important international organization in the nuclear non-proliferation regime is the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. And this is an international government organization which is set up for this purpose, among others. It is the verification agency for the NPT, and has an enormous responsibility to assure that for well over 150 non-nuclear weapon states in the world that are involved in this organization, that their nuclear programs are dedicated to peaceful use, as they should be under the NPT. And what we're seeing in the polar world is that the countries that in the initial development stage of the regime during the 1960s, 70s set up the rules for verification and for non-proliferation. These countries were led by the United States and a few countries in the West, but importantly, they were joined by the Soviet Union in this, as you pointed out, this bipolar system, situation. And today, we have countries that are challenging this system. The Russians are moving away from that understanding with the West. They are, together with the Chinese, in policymaking bodies at the IAEA, they're challenging the West and the United States in rulemaking on non-proliferation related issues, on safeguards, for example, for verification. We are hearing in this group a anti-Western, anti-colonial narrative that is designed to appeal to the mass number of non-nuclear weapon states in the system. They want to recruit these countries into their camp away from the West. And so this is a challenge, and they do this by putting forth a narrative that is based on national sovereignty, where they will argue that the further development of the non-proliferation regime, more effective international atomic energy safeguards, better compliance mechanisms, that these things represent a kind of mission creep on the part of the IAEA on behalf of the West. So this is one of the things we're dealing with right now in the policymaking organs of that agency.
Thank you, Mark. I'll get back to some of the points that you've mentioned earlier, but one last point that you've mentioned, I think, is particularly important in the discussion, which is the leading U.S. role in non-proliferation effort in the past, and that's something that our guest, our distinguished fellow Rose has written about in an article last year. You've called for more effective diplomacy with Russia and the leading U.S. role to bring down the nuclear temperature. In light of the Ukraine war, how effective can diplomacy be in changing the current status quo? Rose, please.
At the moment, it doesn't look too hopeful, of course. Since last year, we have been continuing to see of course, Russia very uncooperative at the nuclear negotiating table. In February of 2023, they ceased their implementation of the New START treaty, the one remaining strategic arms reduction treaty still in force. They ceased their implementation. I want to stress they did not withdraw from the treaty, so they have continued to comply with the limits of the treaty, but in no way are they allowing on-site inspection or other verification activities. They're not exchanging information or providing notifications. So it is a difficult, very difficult moment in terms of thinking about the future, especially at a time when the Chinese are modernizing and building up their nuclear forces. So I do believe that we are on the cusp of a new nuclear arms race involving the three largest nuclear powers. And so that in itself, I think, will be a spur to proliferation elsewhere unless we can slam the brakes on. I continue to be hopeful that we can slam the brakes on because it's not in the interest of any of the three largest nuclear powers to be pouring resources into more nuclear weapons and more nuclear delivery vehicles at a time when we have much more complex challenges across the world that, yes, involve our security forces and our ability to exercise military power, but also involve our ability to exercise political and economic power as well. So I think in some ways, Russia, China, the United States, none of us needs the distraction of a major nuclear arms race, nor the resource burden of a major nuclear arms race. But I do worry about it. I know countries are watching very, very carefully now to see exactly where the nuclear weapon states will be headed, and that in turn will affect their nuclear thinking. But since I wrote that article last year, Mohammed, I've had to say, it's a pessimistic moment because I do engage quite regularly with the Russians in Track 2 discussions, and the consistent and persistent message is that as long as the United States does not respond to Vladimir Putin's concern about U.S. assistance to Ukraine, there is no possibility that Russia will be willing to return to the nuclear negotiating table. And this is unprecedented because historically the United States and USSR, later the United States and the Russian Federation, we tried to keep nuclear disarmament and arms control efforts in a kind of separate basket, separated from other issues about which we disagreed profoundly. During the Vietnam War, for example, Soviet technicians and military experts were helping the North Vietnamese to shoot down American aircraft over Hanoi. But that did not prevent the Nixon administration at the time from negotiating with the USSR on the first Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, as well as the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that was a period of profound differences, Cold War differences between our two countries, but we still managed to make progress on non-proliferation and arms control. At the moment, there is none of that, quite honestly. And to me, it seems sometimes in talking to Russian counterparts at the moment that the Russians are essentially trying to keep the lights on in terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the disarmament responsibilities that they have under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So to be honest with you, at the moment, it is very discouraging. And I don't know what in turn that will mean for proliferation in a multipolar world, but I fear it will not be a good trend line. And that does concern me very, very much.
Thank you, Rose, for this. Just a follow-up question based on your outlook, which is basically, you mentioning the how in the past it was put in a separate basket, and there was cooperation there, although disagreement elsewhere. And the question that pops is basically whether, given the insecurities that we've discussed with Mark previously, the multiple conflicts that we're seeing, the rising concerns about regional competition in different regions. Do you think that there are too many sticks in the wheels of non-proliferation, and what kind of approach do you think we should take? Or the U.S. specifically, because it's it was playing a leading role in non-proliferation efforts, and that's something that you've stressed that the U.S. has to embark on again and resume in some way.
It's my view that the United States must absolutely continue to play a leadership role in non-proliferation efforts as well as in disarmament efforts. It is, to my mind, a terrible shame that the Russian Federation is not willing to play that leadership role at the moment. And frankly, China has not stepped up to the bar either, although they are rapidly modernizing their nuclear forces. And both of those countries are nuclear weapon states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but they have stood back at this moment from any leadership in this area. So I think it's incumbent on the United States to continue to play a strong leadership role in every way it can. And to be honest, in looking at preparations for the upcoming preparatory meeting of the NPT review cycle, which will take place in this summer, in July of this year, and listening to the non-nuclear weapon states, they are alarmed that somehow attention is wandering away from the necessity of continued efforts in the non-proliferation and disarmament space. And so they are looking for ways, willy-nilly, come what may, to continue to make progress. And talking to a number of countries, there is, of course, as we say, in the NPT world, there are three pillars. Disarmament and non-proliferation are two of those pillars, but peaceful uses of the atom is the third pillar of the NPT. And so nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states seem like they can gather around this notion of enhancing cooperation on peaceful uses of the atom, not only for nuclear energy, but also for industrial applications, for medical isotope, cancer treatment, medicine in general. So there is this notion that, okay, at the moment, if we can't do anything else, let's concentrate altogether on peaceful uses. Well, I try to be an optimist. I certainly try to be an optimist about the non-proliferation treaty regime. And so I hope that a major effort to gather around this pillar and to work hard on it will pay dividends in other areas. For one thing, I do think it would pay dividends in terms of climate benefit, in terms of benefit to countries across the world where there is uneven access to things like cancer treatment. So if medical isotope production can be more widely distributed or in other ways more widely provided, I think that would be a very good thing for countries across the world. And in that way, I talked a moment ago about the Russians barely keeping the lights on. But I think in that way, we do more than barely keep the lights on with a non-proliferation treaty regime. We might generate some increased energy to work the non-proliferation and disarmament problems. You're hearing my optimistic side, Mohammed, but but I don't want listeners to go away with the notion that I'm saying all is lost with regard to non-proliferation and the non-proliferation treaty, because I don't believe that. When I talk to nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states alike, there is an enormous commitment to retaining the treaty and looking for every way that we can to continue to implement it and also strengthen it.
Thank you. Great points there, Rose. Nicole, I'm just speaking about Iran, and Rose mentioned now, the concern among non-nuclear states, and also that's something that Mark highlighted in his comments, is him saying Iran is a main driver of proliferation of nuclear weapons or nuclear programs across the region and elsewhere. The former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak has said that Iran had already crossed the nuclear threshold, and it is merely now a political question. Has the world reconciled with the idea of a nuclear Iran, or are still there any openings for non-proliferation diplomacy?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I think many of the points that both Rose and Mark spoke about the non-proliferation regime and also this growing multipolarity really is at the heart of any kind of resolution when it comes to the Iranian nuclear issue. Iran still has not crossed the threshold. Iran still hasn't made the political decision to weaponize. However, we do know in the past, Iran has quite a bit of experience prior to 2003 working on some research and development in that area. So Iran is quite close to obtaining a nuclear weapon. However, they've not made that decision. And I think that's something very important, especially when we're looking at the war in Gaza and Iran's threat perceptions and some of the rhetoric that's coming out of Iran right now, which has been very alarming, and especially in response to things that the Israelis have said. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization even threatened the potential of Iran's nuclear weapon in response to Israeli threats. And so Iran has shown that it has leveraged its kind of ability to potentially cross the threshold in this conflict. Iran has used this as kind of a bargaining chip and as almost as a virtual deterrent in essence right now. And this has a lot to do with the current situation domestically in Iran, the kind of emboldening of hardliners, the also, intense economic crisis. However, I don't think that, a solution to the Iranian nuclear issue is completely out of the picture. I think that there is some room for diplomacy, as we saw prior to the war in Gaza. The United States and Iran essentially abided by this moratorium on strikes in Syria, starting in March 2023. Obviously, that broke down. There were kind of third-party facilitated discussions between the United States and Iran, and some back channels through Oman. But there is a threat of potentially that Iran sees as a change in administration, a backtracking on policy, and I think within Iran, there is a doubt about the longevity of any kind of deal with the United States. So there's a lot of issues that are at play right now. And I think that the current regional developments are emboldening some more hardline voices within Iran when it comes to its nuclear program. But I wouldn't suggest, and I wouldn't be too optimistic about this in the current context, but if Iran hasn't made this decision domestically, politically, there's a lot of costs. And I think Iran's cognizant of that. So I think it really just matters about what we would see happening in the next few months, especially with the war in Gaza.
Thank you, Nicole, for that. I'm just going to go back to Mark on the question of Iran. What Nicole mentioned and also what Rose mentioned earlier. Basically, how Iran is going to drive not proliferation across the region in case it decides to take on or decides to build a nuclear weapon. The question for you is, how do you see? You've written quite a few pieces about different nuclear programs across the region, which are proliferating and have been proliferating in the past decade. So the question is, how do you see Iran's nuclear ambitions shaping, the region's nuclear programs and proliferation in the next years, or perhaps in the next decade?
Well, it's a very good question. It's very pertinent. I wouldn't want to underestimate the extent to which the outcome of the Iranian crisis will have an effect on the future of nuclear energy and nuclear non-proliferation worldwide for a very, very long time. In the present crisis, I would hesitate to try to predict the future and try to lay down what I think the region will look like in the nuclear area in 5 to 10 years.
There are ongoing nuclear programs that you've written about, and I think
Yeah.
it would be useful to see how these develop in light of Iran, let's say, pursuing a nuclear weapon.
Well, clearly, the biggest impact in the region would be whether or not Iran gets nuclear weapons. The ones that to watch after that, of course, would be Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Israel, the United States, and non-nuclear weapons states in the region and elsewhere. We shouldn't forget that basically, regardless of how this progresses, the United States and Israel have both vowed that they would never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. We don't know what this means in practice. That it could mean that there would be, in the final analysis, a military attack if they feel that Iran will be crossing the line. If they do that, in my view, that would probably unleash a massive retaliation on the part of Iran and its proxies that would, shatter the region profoundly. And the other question, of course, being whether the world, including the region, would respond to Iran obtaining nuclear weapons by essentially accommodating a nuclear Iran. There, in the shadow of this is the DPRK. We don't know how that will work out. We don't know very much about Iran's intentions in this regard. That said, the other countries in the region that have embarked on nuclear programs will, if we assume, for the purpose of this exercise, that the Iranian nuclear crisis remains frozen or is resolved in some satisfactory way, we could assume that the outcome would be that there would be more nuclear power in the region. These programs will go further. Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, all three will have more nuclear power. I don't believe that any of those states would become a nuclear proliferator in the short term or medium term. In any event, Israel will remain an outlier in the system with nuclear weapons. I've had conversations with people in Israel that make it crystal clear to me that they have no intention in giving up their nuclear weapons capability. And the other question, of course, being Saudi Arabia, a country which is on the horizon and on the radar screen worldwide, because it has already made clear, at least in a programmatic way, publicly, that it will not tolerate a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran. They will try to match that capability, essentially putting the world on notice that their nuclear non-proliferation commitment is extremely circumscribed in this particular way. So if that were to happen, if Iran were to become a nuclear weapons power, a nuclear weapons country, Saudi Arabia would be basically then watched carefully to see how it would move further. And all bets are off. Basically, it would imply that there would be massive surveillance on the part of Western governments, particularly to make sure that they understood everything that was happening in that country in the nuclear area. If Saudi Arabia obtained by that point nuclear cooperation from any of the countries that I mentioned before, those countries would be expected to step up to the bar and make sure that any nuclear cooperation that it had with Saudi Arabia would not result in any proliferation-related incidents. And they would be behind the scenes, they would be pressed hard by the international community to intervene to make sure that they would find out as much as they could about the intentions and activities in Saudi Arabia. So there would be a challenge to Saudi Arabia to move forward, in fact, with its peaceful nuclear program right away as a result of Iran becoming a nuclear armed country. And the same would be the case for any other state in the neighborhood. That would include Turkey, that would include Egypt. So, a nuclear armed Iran would be a major hindrance for the further development of nuclear power in the region at a time when countries in the Middle East are increasingly interested in developing nuclear programs for peaceful use.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, the point that you've mentioned about the states engaged in nuclear cooperation or developing nuclear capabilities in non-nuclear states. I wanted to pick up on that and ask Rose about whether any U.S. diplomatic effort that you've basically vouching for and you think is necessary in the next phase. Whether this should encompass countries where Russia is actively engaged in building nuclear programs. We've seen Russia expand its cooperation in this field, and I think it would be useful to understand where the map of its cooperation on this front and how it might lead to proliferation in the next phase, and whether you think that any U.S. effort should also cover that aspect of Russia's nuclear policy.
Yes, I wish I could be, how shall I say, more optimistic in this regard, because the United States, the current administration, has prior to the war in Gaza and the terrible tragedies and crisis there, the United States had been very vigorously engaged with Saudi Arabia on a deal for making peace with Israel. To be honest, I'm not an expert on the region. You could probably tell me, but I do think that they will get back to that process at some point in the future. But during those negotiations, the United States and Saudi Arabia were talking quite a bit about the Saudis' ambitions to develop peaceful nuclear energy, a nuclear energy program, and the Saudis were, basically saying, "Well, we'd like to work with you, but we have perhaps some other options out there," i.e., the Russians, in terms of acquiring nuclear energy technology with many fewer constraints than the United States generally places on countries to avoid proliferation into nuclear weapons programs. And so this is an area where I am a bit concerned that this trade-off, the peace deal with Israel, could come at the cost of continuing U.S. High standards in terms of pressing for countries to sign up to non-proliferation commitments and then to abide by them. So I do think that there are some concerns there. I don't know exactly what the contours of a so-called 1-2-3 agreement with Saudi Arabia would look like in this particular context, but I do think it is something that the expert community needs to take close account of, and also that I understand the U.S. Congress has been paying attention to as well. And we will see what could what could develop, because as you may be aware, a few years ago, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, signed up to a 123 agreement where they agreed to eschew enrichment and reprocessing of nuclear material. But if the Saudis get a more favorable deal from the United States, the UAE would be in a position potentially to reconsider their arrangements as well. So it could lead to broader proliferation in the region, and for that reason, I think we need to be we need to be very, very aware of what is happening with the Saudis in negotiation of an agreement for nuclear cooperation with the United States. But your question, Mohanad, got to the where the Russians are already doing business and whether we need to be doing our best to be interacting with those countries on this issue. I believe the answer to that question is a very firm yes. Saudi Arabia is one example, but anywhere where the Russian Federation is making strides in terms of selling its nuclear energy technology, I think we need to be fully engaged and in communication with those countries and trying to continue once again to press the highest standards of non-proliferation behavior, even though we may have precious few levers in that space. Perhaps we have some levers that we can apply in other spaces to encourage those countries to continue to abide by their commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty.
Excellent. The question of Iran's role and ambitions and its basically being the trigger for more proliferation across the region. Do you see similar cases elsewhere? I mean, are there, are we looking at a wider proliferation globally, or, aside from the region, which is seeing, different nuclear programs being developed?
The other major driver of proliferation nowadays, obviously, is the rapid moves of North Korea to acquire not only advanced nuclear warhead capability, but also more and more advanced and long-range delivery systems, missile systems. And so that is a potential driver for proliferation in Northeast Asia, and countries in the region, particularly the Republic of Korea, South Korea, have from time to time, individuals there, experts there, politicians there have expressed an interest in acquiring indigenous nuclear weapons capability. It's been quite a vigorous debate in Seoul in the past few years. And Seoul, because of their large nuclear energy program, they do have a good resource for bomb building in the fissile materials that they have been able to accumulate over the years because of their civil nuclear energy program. And so sitting on a mountain of plutonium helps them if they do want to proceed with a nuclear bomb building program. They already have the basic and most important element of that, and that is fissile material. So I think that we need to be very, very closely watching and interacting with South Korea. I give the Biden administration high marks for the work that they have been doing to engage with the South Koreans, including the visit of their president to Washington last May, when a major statement was signed between the U.S. president and the ROK president that has really bolstered extended U.S. nuclear deterrence for the Korean Peninsula. And I think that was a very, very good move.
It's interesting that you've mentioned South Korea. Of course, South Korea, there was a statement to that effect. I think the South Korean president has spoken about nuclear capability or the potential of nuclear capabilities in the future. But also Saudi Arabia, another U.S. ally, Egypt, a U.S. ally, also, all developing their own, or either developing or interested in developing their nuclear capabilities. But do you think, within this context, the U.S. is kind of losing leverage or losing its ability to control these ambitions and try to contain the proliferation because of the emerging threats, whether Iran in the Middle East or North Korea, as you've mentioned?
The biggest problem for the United States, I mentioned the the levers that the United States has to apply to encourage countries or impel countries to engage in certain behaviors. One of the biggest problems is in this particular space, the United States does not itself have very wide-ranging nuclear energy technologies to deploy. It's the Russians, the South Koreans, the Chinese, other countries that have surged ahead in developing more modern and efficient nuclear energy capabilities and capacity, including these so-called small modular reactors. And the United States has been struggling to rebuild its nuclear energy industry over the last decade and will continue to do so. The United States, there's no reason why the United States can't compete in this space. It's just that I feel like we have allowed our nuclear energy industry to lag seriously and even in some cases to wither and die over the past 2 to 3 decades. So we have a lot of work to do to compete in this space. And for that reason, our leverage is rather limited, I would say. I was amused to see quotes again from the Saudi leadership saying, well, of course we want to have the best technology. So i.e. we'd like to deal with you, the United States, but we may need to turn to other options. Well, they may need to turn to other options, not only because of the stringent U.S. nonproliferation requirements, but also the fact that the United States does not really have the same range of nuclear energy technologies available to offer. And that is one of the major problems at this time. And particularly if we're trying to, play this game of ensuring a high standard of nonproliferation behavior, it's difficult. We're going to have to look for levers to apply from other directions, whether it's provision of other kinds of technologies. I hesitate to say it, military, non-nuclear technologies, or other kinds of assistance and cooperation.
Thank you, Rose. Nicole, speaking about the leading U.S. role, might we see a new regional non-proliferation effort, especially in light of the Chinese role in the Saudi-Iran deal, for instance, last year? Is that a possibility to look at in the next phase?
I mean, it depends on if you consider China a regional actor in the Middle East, which China is obviously an external power and part of the P5. I don't see China assuming this role as kind of being the leading state to solve the Iranian nuclear issue. China, under the original JCPOA, had certain civilian nuclear cooperation responsibilities, such as converting Iran's heavy water reactor and kind of construction around that. But China really hasn't been involved in pressuring Iran. I know that there's concerns from the Chinese side on whether or not Iran would, obtain a nuclear weapon, but I don't see China emerging as a major actor. In the Middle East, I mean, Oman has played a helpful role in facilitating back-channel discussions, but there doesn't seem like there's going to be this kind of consortium of states that come and resolve this issue. So the kind of chance for alternative mediators regionally within the Middle East are very slim. And that's, I think, an issue is, Iran's nuclear program, also Iran's activity, has often been driven by its animosity with countries, including Saudi Arabia. And you see Iran still harboring a lot of these views. And of course, Iran feels much more confident now because of the agreement with the Saudis. But this hasn't really resulted in the kind of role that Iran maybe perhaps would like to play in the region, with much more of a leadership role. And I don't see Iran accepting any kind of conditions from a different regional state on its nuclear program. I mean, Iran is very much shielded by secrecy, and I think that was something you saw throughout the JCPOA negotiations, and even currently with the IAEA, with Iran kicking out inspectors, with Iran violating board resolutions. A lot of this kind of activity right now is driven by this sense of kind of paranoia about interference internally, and also about this intense sense of secrecy within Iran. So I think a regional arrangement on some kind of solution to the Iranian nuclear issues is difficult. There's not as much leverage regionally on Iran for many of its neighbors. So I think that would be much more difficult than perhaps maybe a European-led or even just a bilateral U.S.-led effort if the Iranians and the U.S. ever decide to sit with each other and speak directly.
So you still think that the U.S. role is central and key in non-proliferation? Because I think, as Rose said, I mean, China is not stepping up and assuming such a role, and doesn't seem, of course, to be a concern for the Russian Federation at the moment. What could change these dynamics? How do you think we can see more cooperation on behalf of these states in non-proliferation efforts, or what could compel them to play a more active role and not leave the United States, for instance, in that central position?
I mean, I think the U.S. has a special role in nonproliferation, partly because of the history of the U.S. and the nonproliferation regime, and also as a nuclear supplier. Of course, the U.S. also has incredible financial power and leverage that it uses quite stringently on a lot of nonproliferation crises. So that's something that I think is unique about the U.S. case. And so when it comes to other regional powers, when it comes to nuclear security or nuclear assistance, I think that's very important. And that's something that should be pursued in the region, is about building up a kind of cohort of individuals with strong backgrounds in nuclear security culture, creating a regional environment where the peaceful use of nuclear energy is also supported by a robust domestic, cadre of experts who do know this technology and its peaceful purposes. And I think that's actually a very interesting way that in the future, maybe 10, 20 years from now, you could see Iran with its experience. Perhaps you see a different kind of regime, you see a different kind of country or nature internally, play this role of actually providing expertise for perhaps nuclear security and for more measures that are actually for peaceful use, rather than this kind of internal covert program that it seems that they're going towards.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. Mark, I just wanted, one question that comes to mind when speaking about the current nuclear proliferation, whether the peaceful programs or those, the armed nuclear armed states, is basically the possibility of accidents happening. For instance, you've written a piece on why the Fukushima disaster could have been avoidable, and now in this era of polarization and multilateral institutions which ensure compliance are needed and required to be even more active than they previously were, and you come across as very worried when it comes to the nuclear crises across the world and the proliferation. I just wanted to ask you whether there are certain aspects of this proliferation and compliance that either that you think could be done, what could be done for any potential accidents or disasters to be avoided, or whether there are aspects of these proliferation and the lack of compliance that really worry you. I think you're muted, so if you can unmute yourself to speak.
Okay. Yeah. I would want to go back to looking at the IAEA in Vienna, where most of these issues having to do with safety, transparency, governance, non-proliferation, compliance, with the basic rules of the road in operating nuclear facilities and carrying out nuclear activities. These things over a period of 50 years have given us a body of information, body of documents, a body of guidelines, some of them binding, about how countries conduct their nuclear business and their nuclear activities. And in the multipolar world, my concern is that the rules that we've established could become questioned and watered down by a debate that would be encouraged by countries that either feel that the existing norms are bothersome, are too much trouble, are too expensive, require too much surveillance and intrusion into their nuclear activities, or countries who are interested in selling their nuclear wares under conditions, as Rose mentioned, that would be less than those that obtain in OECD countries, for example, for most of these rubrics. And these decisions on the shape of the regime and the robustness of the standards and guidelines that we have worldwide, this debate, as it continues, will be taking place in the governing bodies of the IEA, the Board of Governors, and the General Conference, among nearly 200 states. And in this debate, there will be pressure applied by powerful actors in the system to change the rules if they want to do that. And where we see is the things that have been mentioned during this meeting so far about how important it is for the United States to have up-to-date technology, to have expertise, to have a body of experts who are at the top of their game, who are developing the technology further and interesting other countries in the future of the technologies and demonstrate a commitment to it. If they do this, it will be easier for the United States to interact in this debate and dialogue. Because if the United States does not stay committed to it, then others will come and they will make changes. The Chinese, for example, have told members of the nuclear suppliers group, which they are members of, that to some extent the Chinese government feels it's incumbent upon them to make changes in the system because they were not in the room in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s when these rules were made. And they are going to intervene on their behalf and in their interest to change these things. And so we will see over time how this debate goes further. And the results will be in the staffing of the IEA, in the financing of it, its budget, its policymaking activities, its programs, and the rules that its experts derive in cooperation with member states. So this is very important for the United States to remain committed to engagement with these countries at the IEA in Vienna. That has been the venue for a lot of American activity in the interest of non-proliferation, nuclear security, and other aspects of nuclear development over a period of 50 years or more. And it should remain so in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Rose, I wanted to see if you have any comments on what Mark said about the IAEA and the need for reform.
Well, I think I always approach these calls for reform with caution, because these bodies have long and I would say very serious traditions of, as well as their rules and protocols for operations. So I never like to see suggestions that things need to be torn asunder and we need to start again with new rules. So, and I know that's not what Mark was suggesting, but I agree, Mark, that there will be a lot of turbulence in the Board of Governors in coming years. But that turbulence doesn't only come from countries who are stepping forward and saying, hey, we need to make adjustments to the rules. It also comes from some of the emergence of new technologies that are out there. I happen to see that there are benefits to some of the new technologies that are available for IAEA inspectors, like robotics, for example, has made a major revolution in how inspectors go about counting the number of storage canisters there are in nuclear fuel pools, those kinds of things. You know, it's very technical, but technology can be a great friend of the IAEA and the work of its inspectors, but it also complicates in many cases what exactly the IAEA will have to regulate in future, and so there will have to be some work done to I think take account of the revolution in new technology developments that is going forward, and how that will affect nuclear reactor operations in the future. So it cannot, of course, be a totally static organization that doesn't serve its interests well. But I do think that we need to be mindful of mischief and mindful when countries want to upend protocols and upend long traditions of cooperation and interaction at the IAEA, because they are the new sheriff in town, or believe that they're the new sheriff in town. I'll put it that way. Is that
Thanks.
diplomatic enough for you, Bojado?
It is, and I love the optimism. It's what we need, I suppose, in the next phase. Thank you, everyone, and we have come to the end of this panel. Very insightful. I would like to thank the speakers, Rose, Mark, and Nicole, for a very insightful discussion. I would like to thank the audience as well for watching us. Have a great day, and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.